After functions accepting functions as input, let's now talk about functions returning functions. And to learn how to do that, let's create a function that creates different interview questions for different jobs. And this is how we're going to do it. For each job, we will return a function that builds a string using the person's name as an input. So basically a function returning another function. So function, let's call it interview question, and it will accept a string which is a job. And then in here, according to each of the different jobs, we will return a different function which will then log a question to the console. So we're going to do an if-else statement here. So if the job is designer, okay, then return, and here comes the fun part, because we will simply return a function which will accept the name, and then in here we put our code. So this is basically an anonymous function, right? So this function here, it's an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. So all of this is what we're going to return if the job is a designer. So console.log, and the interview question for a designer will be first the name, because we will pass that into the function, right? So here is the name parameter, and then let's ask the person, can you please explain what UX design is? So user experience design. Okay, and now another job, let's say a teacher. So teacher, and in here we again return a function, an anonymous function again, which also accepts a name and then a similar string, so console.log, and then it's a teacher, so let's ask the teacher in the interview, what subject do you teach? And then maybe the name of the person. Okay, now we could continue this with a lot of jobs, or we could even have used a switch statement, right? But I don't want to overcomplicate things here, because this is just for demonstration. So I will just leave these two, and then here an else statement. And again, we're going to return a function. And in here, we'll once again console and then ask hello, then the name. What do you do? So just a random question if we don't know the job. Alright, so this function here that we just wrote will not just return a simple value as we usually do with functions, right? So instead it returns an entire function that we can then use later. And this is possible because functions are always first-class functions in JavaScript, because they are effectively objects. So we simply actually return an object here, right? It's simply an object that happens to be a function. So let's now use this. And remember, this returns a function, so we have to store the result somewhere. So let's create a variable, and I will call this one a teacher question. So this means it will be a question always for teachers. So now interview question, and then what I pass into it is the string teacher. And now if I run this, then this teacher question variable here will be the function that is returned from the interview question when we pass teacher. Where is it? So here. So again, this variable teacher question down here will now be this function here, right? This is just like when we store a function expression in the variable. This is the exact same thing, right? So let's now use this, and I'm going to say teacher question and the name John. So I'm now calling this variable here, which is a function, and I will put the name John into it here, right? Because as we know, this function accepts a name as an input. So let's see what happens. Alright, so what subject do you teach John? Exactly as expected. So with this method, we can basically write one generic function, which is the interview question in this case, and then create a bunch of more specific functions based on that generic function. And in our case, that's this function here, the teacher question, which produces questions for teachers. So we can now also create a function which produces questions for designers, right? So let's say designer question. And then again, we simply call the interview question function, right? But this time with the designer as the argument. And now we have a function which is for designers. So let's console log this here as well. So designer question, and again, John. Let's console log this. Okay, so I misspelled something here. All right, so it's question. Okay. So, John, can you please explain what UX design is? So once again, we have now created a bunch of more specific functions here. So the teacher question and the designer question functions based on our more generic function, which is the interview question function. And we could now go ahead and use this as many times as we want. So let's say designer question for Jane, and for Mark, and for Mike. And to get the point, right? So we can now use this for as many, let's say, designers as we want. So Jane, Mark, and Mike. So all of them will get this question. Let me just show you now that we could also have done this in a different way. So let's say interview question. Okay. And then teacher. And as you know, this will return a function, right? So this will return this function here. And we don't even need to store it in a variable. We can call it right away. So we can use the parentheses once again and then put, let's say, Mark in here. So this looks a bit strange, but it works. And that's because this is evaluated from left to right. So first this part here, so the interview question function gets called, it returns a function, and then with this here we call the function that was returned before with Mark. So let's see. And yes, this still works. What subject do you teach Mark? Alright, so this is of course a really simple example, but it shows you how useful this technique can be. And it really takes some time to getting used to this way of thinking and using functions. But once you understood, it can be really powerful. Okay, and once again, I really want to encourage you to try this out on your own, write your own functions, and do some experiments with these new concepts of first-class functions. And after that, you can just proceed with the course. So see you then.